All right, imagine sitting in a police station thinking you're just helping out with an investigation. You answer their questions, you tell them what you know, and then suddenly, the door closes and you realize you're not going anywhere. That's exactly what happened to Christopher Tapp, a guy who walked into an interrogation room as a witness and walked out with a life sentence. And the case? It all started on June 13, 1996, in Idaho Falls, Idaho, one of those small towns where crime is so rare that people barely lock their doors. But that morning, everything changed. 18-year-old Angie Dodge had recently moved into her own place, excited about starting her adult life. But when she didn't show up for work, a friend went to check on her. What they found inside her apartment sent shockwaves through the entire town. Police arrived and immediately saw that this was no burglary gone wrong. Nothing was stolen, nothing was out of place, except for what had been done to Angie. Whoever was in that apartment that night wasn't there for money or valuables. This was intentional, targeted, and deeply disturbing. Investigators knew this case needed to be solved fast. And when they found DNA at the crime scene, they thought they had their answer. If they could match the DNA, they'd have their guy. Except they didn't. Because when they ran the sample, no match. And suddenly, everything changed. This was the kind of crime that doesn't just go away. People were terrified. Parents kept their kids inside. Women carried pepper spray. The police were under massive pressure to make an arrest, fast. And instead of waiting for a solid lead, they decided to force one. Their approach? Round up young men from town and start interrogating them until someone broke. And that's how Christopher Tapp ended up in an interrogation room. Chris was 20 years old, no criminal record, no history of violence. He wasn't even a suspect. He was just a guy who hung out with people the cops had already questioned. But at this point, they weren't looking for the right suspect. They were looking for any suspect. At first, Chris wasn't worried. He figured, I'll answer their questions and I'll be out of here. But the second the door shut behind him, everything changed. The officers sat him down and immediately went on the attack. They told him his friends had already turned on him. They said, "We know you were there. Just tell us what happened, and this will all go easier for you." When he denied it, they pushed harder. For hours, they kept repeating the same things over and over. "We know you were there, we just need you to be honest." They made promises. "If you just admit to being there, we can work something out." And Chris? He started breaking down. He was exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely out of his depth. That's when the cops started feeding him details. At first, his answers didn't match what they wanted, so they'd stop him and say, "No, that's not right. Try again." Over and over, until eventually, he started repeating their version of events. And the second they got him to say the words they needed, that was it. Case closed. It didn't matter that his DNA didn't match. It didn't matter that his story kept changing. It didn't matter that he had never even met Angie Dodge. The cops had a confession on tape, and in their eyes, that was all they needed. Chris was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and sent straight to trial. Now he's sitting in a courtroom, watching prosecutors play his confession for the jury. But what they don't play, the parts where he denied everything for hours, the parts where the cops fed him information, the parts where he was clearly confused and terrified. The jury hears only the pieces that make him sound guilty. And when the verdict comes down? Guilty. Life in prison. Chris Tapp, who had never even been in trouble before, is now locked away in maximum security, paying for something he had nothing to do with. And while he's sitting in a cell, the actual person responsible? Still out there. Real quick, if you like this story so far, go ahead and like, comment, and hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. On Tailscape. All right, back to it. Chris Tapp is 23 years old, sitting in a maximum security prison, staring at a life sentence for a crime he didn't commit. Every appeal, denied. Every letter asking for help, ignored. Every day that passes, a reminder that the justice system failed him. But outside those prison walls, someone is about to change everything. Carol Dodge, Angie Dodge's mother. At first, she believed the police had found the right guy. She trusted the system. But as time went on, doubts crept in. The more she looked into Chris's so-called confession, the more things didn't add up. And then she did something no one expected. She watched the full interrogation tapes, and what she saw made her sick. This wasn't a confession. It was manipulation. The detectives fed him details, corrected his answers, pressured him into agreeing with their version of events. He looked scared, lost, exhausted. He didn't sound like someone confessing to a crime. He sounded like someone trying to make the questioning stop. And then came the final red flag. The DNA from the crime scene still didn't match him. If Chris was guilty, why wasn't there a single piece of physical evidence tying him to the apartment? Why was there DNA that belonged to someone else? Carol Dodge went from believing in Chris's guilt to becoming the loudest voice fighting for his freedom. She teamed up with private investigators, attorneys, and forensic experts to push for new DNA testing. The case that had been closed for over a decade was about to be ripped wide open. In 2014, forensic technology had advanced enough that investigators could run the crime scene DNA through a genealogy database, the same technique that would later catch the Golden State Killer. The results? Still no match to Chris Tapp. At this point, the case was impossible to ignore. Chris's legal team started filing new motions, pointing out the obvious. There was never any real evidence against him. His conviction had been built entirely on a confession that detectives had forced out of him. In 2017, after 20 years behind bars, Chris Tapp walked back into a courtroom. The prosecution had no choice. The DNA at the scene belonged to someone else. And Chris's confession had been exposed as completely unreliable. His conviction was vacated. Chris walked out of prison a free man. But even after 20 years, even after the state admitted his confession was garbage, there was still one problem. His name wasn't cleared. The conviction was overturned, but he wasn't officially declared innocent. On paper, he was just a guy who got out on a technicality. And while Chris was finally free, the real person responsible? Still unidentified. Then, in 2019, investigators ran the crime scene DNA through a new system, and this time they got a match. Chris Tapp is finally free, but his name still not cleared. For 2 decades, he sat in a prison cell for something he didn't do. The conviction had been overturned, but legally, he was never officially declared innocent. Everywhere he went, people still whispered, maybe he was involved somehow. Employers didn't want to hire him. The justice system had taken 20 years of his life, and now it wasn't giving him anything back. But then, in 2019, everything changed. Investigators ran the DNA from the crime scene through a new forensic genealogy database, the same type of technology used to catch the Golden State Killer. And this time, they got a match. For the first time since 1996, they had a name, Brian Lee Dripps. And the wildest part? Dripps had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. This wasn't some runaway fugitive who skipped town after the crime. He wasn't some shadowy figure who had never crossed paths with Angie Dodge. He had been living in Idaho Falls the entire time. And back in 1996, when this whole case started, he lived across the street from Angie Dodge. The entire time, police were forcing a confession out of an innocent man. The real person responsible was right there, walking through the same town, living his life without a single consequence. Once detectives found the DNA match, they tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. And when they confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Brian Dripps confessed immediately. He admitted he had acted alone. He admitted Christopher Tapp was never involved. The justice system had put an innocent man away for 20 years, while the real suspect lived freely. In 2021, Dripps pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. And Chris, for the first time in 25 years, he was fully exonerated. Think about that. 2 decades of his life, gone. He went into prison at 20. He came out at 40. He lost everything, his youth, his opportunities, his future, and all because of a forced confession. His name is finally cleared, but nothing changes the fact that he spent half his life paying for something he didn't do. And the scariest part? This happens more often than people think. False confessions aren't rare accidents. They happen because of pressure, exhaustion, and manipulation. Innocent people admit to crimes they didn't commit because they're broken down by the system. Chris Tapp was lucky. He had people fighting for him, but how many others don't? That's the story. Now I want to hear what you think. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. And if you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.